Hi, I'm Nancy Murphy. Today I'm going to teach you how to paint the beach. This is the reference photo of the painting. Make a black and white version of that painting and then print it on your printer. If you can, choose it with the same dimensions. So if it's a square, you can do a 1 by 1, you can do a 2 by 2. Here, my canvas is an 8 by 10, so I'm printing it as an 8 by 10, but borderless so that it fills the entire paper. Now you want to draw grids. Draw a line down the middle, draw a line across the middle so you have 4 squares, and use a ruler to measure. And then you can break it down into other squares that are equal in size. You can continue to put 4 squares within each individual square, and you want to look down and measure, okay, here's a square, and here's approximately where the horizon line is, about a third, maybe a little bit lower than a third in that one square. So you kind of map it out and look at the lines that you have and where things fall and the angles they go. And the sketch does not need to be perfect. It doesn't need to look like the reference photo. You just need to get in a rough idea. You're looking at shapes, not the whole painting as a picture, but look at the shapes. And in that square you have the line that goes down a little bit. It starts up on the top of that square and goes down a little bit. And this is also at an angle. Continue to do this for the entire picture and all the squares. So I'm adding 4 squares within that larger square to help me get the dimensions right. When you finish, go ahead and erase all of the pencil marks from the grid. And then reinforce the lines that you've drawn. And you're going to get you're going to get pencil all over your hand because it gets a little bit messy. But you want to make sure that the sketch is dark enough so when you do the underpainting or the toning of the canvas, you want to be able to make it dark enough so that you can see it through the paint. There's the mess. Now I'm erasing the cloud because it doesn't need to be too dark. So for my underpainting, I use a combination of the ultramarine blue and a little bit of the Payne's gray. And you go through and you wipe out the lightest light areas from the reference photo. You're still looking at the black and white photo. It helps to show you where the lightest lights are and the darkest darks. So I just dampen a cloth or a paper towel and continually look at your reference photo to know where to wipe things out or to add dark colors. I start with the lightest because the canvas is still wet from the underpainting or from the wash. So now I'm going to be using just the Payne's gray with a slight bit of water and just blocking in the color. You're not trying to make it perfect. And you'll have some errors here that you don't like, and that's okay, and you can correct them when you start painting. Because all of these things will be covered with paint. They're just showing you where the shadows are and the lightest lights. So it's starting to look more like it. I'm just taking another look and adding some other colors shadows. I'm making it a little darker in some of the areas that are darker than the dark that I've been adding. Doing this stage, it's like the bones in a body. It gives you form and structure that you can build the rest on top of to make it look realistic, or to make it look like the reference image. And because the sky is going to be a pretty bright sky with white fluffy clouds, there's no reason to add any shadow to the clouds. And in this area, I mess up a little bit on my lines, and I'll have to fix them later on with other paint. I just have them all in the same direction and pretty much the same length. I don't like it. So there you have it. The underpainting is finished. It's time to add paint on top of the underpainting. So I'm trying a new paint that I bought, about 16 of them. We're going to paint the sky next. When painting a painting, you want to paint from the furthest toward the closest in the painting. So since the sky is the furthest away, we start with that. I'm using a filbert brush, which is a rounded end, and you want to start with the darkest paint on the top and progressively work to lighter and lightest on the very bottom on the horizon. So that's not going on the way I want, so I switched to an angled brush that has a little more firmness to smear the paint around. You want to use a lot of paint so that it stays wet and allows you to blend. Keep switching brushes, changing it up to get the effects that you want. And for this painting, I'm painting all the strokes in a horizontal pattern to make it nice and smooth. So I'm using the lightest blue on the horizon line, and don't worry about painting over your underpainting. I had painted the grass too thick anyway, so it needed to be redone. And again, if your brush is not achieving what you want, switch it up. Next, I'm going to use a dry brush, a large brush, to blend every layer. Make sure that large brush is dry. If you add water, it's just going to smear the paint and you won't achieve what you want. Just long, soft strokes. So now, because you want to paint the clouds, you want to dry the brush off, take all the excess paint off, and then you're going to be working with solid white. And I had too much on my brush, so I just dabbed it on my palm, and I just kind of smear it around in any pattern, or you can use the reference photo for the clouds if you want. The paint underneath is starting to dry, so it's making it pretty tough to blend. That's why it's important to really work fast when you do large areas that need to be blended. So because it's getting too dry and I'm not liking the sharper edges, I'm going to go back and use some of the background color, the blue, to add more paint and make it moist so that I can move the paint around again. Dab it a little bit, I had too much. See how that softens the lines? And I took off a little too much of the dark on the top, so I added more of that dark on the top, medium in the middle, and lightest on the bottom. So here it's starting to really take shape. I'm happy with how it's turning out. And continuing to blend. So it's layer on layer and blending and blending. So I'm going back with some of the darker blue to add a little more depth and dimension, softening the side, just kind of working through to break the clouds up a little. And really push your brush hard to get it into the canvas and blend it. So moving along, we're going to do the horizon line and the water. And if you ever paint over where you don't want, as long as the paint is still wet, you can just flip it upside down or sideways and with a wet brush and just clean off the extra. So I'm mixing a variety of blues from darkest to light and moving from the darkest dark, which is on the horizon line, and the lightest light on the shore. And I'm using a tiny brush because my canvas is only 8 by 10. And here you just barely tap the waves. And for the brightest bright, the foam, I use just a pure white. And remember, this is just the first layer. I can go back later on and add to it or take away. And the darkest sand goes right at the shoreline where it's wet. And as you move further away from the water, the sand gets lighter in the brightest areas and darkest in the shadowed areas. And here I'm going back and forth with the blue and the sand to create a better looking beach line. So for the sand, I'm using a gray and a titanium white or an unbleached titanium and mixing it. And for the darkest shadows, I'm mixing in even just a little bit of a Payne's gray, which is a bluish black, and to the base and the middle of the plants, and just kind of rubbing it in. So for the dunes, you want to use a combination of these colors, and you mix them in a variety of colors and shades, and use kind of scraggly brushes to achieve the look of grass. So before we do the grass blades, we're going to rub in the paint in the different shades for the shadows. And to give a little more smoother look, I'm using a brush that's an angled brush, and I mixed in just a tiny bit of Algerian crimson, or you can use red. And you just kind of move the paint around in the direction the sand will go where the grass goes. So if the dune kind of goes up, you put it at an angle. If it's flat and straight, you just do it horizontally. And when you add the darker colors, don't cover them completely when you come in with the next layer. Leave part of it showing. So I'm adding some of the brighter brights, and I'm not covering up all the shadowed areas. I'm just adding it down the middle of the path or in areas where the sun is hitting it hardest. And it's important to leave some of the background showing through, because if you've ever looked at sand, it's not perfectly smooth, at least not on most beaches. You have little bits of dark parts coming through and light parts. Every footprint creates an indentation, which gives you a shadow. So I'm using the angled brush again to make it a little more smooth, blending it a little bit more. here are the colors you're going to use for the grass. Just a combination. For the darkest, you want to do a burnt umber, and then you can mix in a sap green next for the next darkest color. And you want to leave parts open because nothing's ever completely dark or light in nature. There are some dark areas and lighter areas. So you're showing that now. You're just putting the darks in to kind of define your shapes right now. You don't need a lot of detail. If you see, I'm moving up and kind of pushing it out the way the grass goes. And I'm starting low, and as I add the different layers, they're going to go up higher and higher and extend out thinner and thinner. And this brush is just a really rough brush that's been used through the years. Later on, I'll move to that scraggly type of brush to give it more of a definition of a grass blade, especially up close. I'm still using the darker colors at the base of each plant. So now I'm moving to more of a medium green by mixing the two and adding a little yellow ochre to that and extending it up and over, and you'll see more the sky and the sand pushing through as the blades are more defined and thinning out. And blades of grass never go in just one direction. They just kind of vary. So make sure you reflect that in your painting. So now I've switched to the thin brush, the kind of scraggly one that has individual bristles. And the paint was a little too dry, so I added just a tiny bit of water to thin it out. And you can see the difference in the blades of grass. And when you do the next layer, you don't want to put as much of the next layer color on. You want to let some of the darker tones show through. And on the tall chunk of grass up on the top, I realized that I needed to have a little more dark pulling it through because it's just too light. So you'll see I'll add that in a little bit. And that's a nice thing about painting. You can go back and make changes as you need it. And don't forget to do some of the tiny pieces of grass sticking out at the base of each of these plants. See there, I'm going and adding a little more of the dark to make it kind of pull the whole plant up so it doesn't look like it's just sticking out of nowhere. So now I'm mixing some of the lightest color for highlights, but again, don't cover every branch, just kind of use it sparingly. Each layer makes it come to life a little bit more. And I'm going back and forth between light, medium, and dark to touch in areas that need a little bit more attention. And if you notice, I don't use the bright yellow directly. I need to mute it a little bit, so I add a little white or yellow ochre to it. And I add a little bit of a yellow reflection on the sand because the yellow in the brush makes it kind of reflective. So now I'm adding a little more of the highlight, and I'm going back in to blend. And I'm touching up some of the paint because some of the underpainting is showing through on the sky, and I didn't make my grass blades go up as high as I had in my original drawing. So I'm just covering them up. And I'm just redefining some of the clouds, adding some highlights. Well, anyway, you're done. Thanks for watching. Head over to my website for more videos, yellow.artist.com.